So whenever I approach a different conservation topic at AWA, I first like to take a historical perspective because while history doesn't repeat, it does often rhyme, and we can learn a lot from those who came before us. So we're going to go back about 100 years. That's where we'll start. So much of the Castle region was once part of Waterton Lakes National Park, but following the First World War, it was transferred over to Alberta's jurisdiction. It was a wildlife refuge until 1954 when it became part of the provincial forest system. For much of the time since then, conservation has not been the first priority for this region. Logging, oil and gas, other industrial developments have been allowed in the area to varying degrees. While this Google Earth time lapse on the side here only starts in 1984, as it progresses, you can see large areas become deforested or change for various human activities in a relatively short time period. The area has also always had an abundance of subsistence and recreation activities here. Traditional cultural activities, hunting, fishing, hiking, trapping, horseback riding, bird watching, you name it. It is a place people want to be, want to enjoy. And so in the summer of 1965, the original lifts at the West Castle Ski Resort are constructed. And by December, the public was enjoying the first runs on the new ski hill. Throughout Alberta's eastern slopes at the time, including the Castle area, public concerns were growing over, oh, sorry, let me move this. Okay, I can't move it, that's fine. Yeah, so public concern was growing over the increasing development and destruction of public lands. Public hearings were held throughout the early 70s to inform what would become the Eastern Slopes Policy, which essentially laid out how the government would manage public lands moving forward to balance sustainable development and environmental protection. And so I highlight this. This is a public engagement done by the Environmental Conservation Authority at the time, which is a really early predecessor of probably environment and protected areas in forestry and parks today. Where they did, public engagement. And you can see even going back to 1970, the main concern here is the watershed. In 1973, during those proceedings, AWA proposes that the South Castle be designated as a wildland recreation area to expand protections in the region. It's not as ambitious as what the parks cover now, but it was a good start. Shortly after, in 1974, a study by the government of Alberta also recommends that a park be established in the headwaters of the Castle River, quote, because of its scenery, natural history, and potential for supporting extensive and intensive recreation interests. In 1975, some of the Canada Winter Games are held at the West Castle Ski Hill. This is also when we see a first proposal to expand year-round recreation at the site. It's evaluated by Alberta's then Ministry of Business, Development and Tourism. In this report, they conclude that, quote, it is highly improbable that any amount of additional capital investment will allow the ski area to operate at a profit. Only if there were superior physical features and natural resources would profitability be possible. In 1976, the day lodge at the ski hill is unfortunately destroyed by a fire, and by 1977, the West Castle Ski Resort is bankrupt. In the same year, the Eastern Slopes Policy is published, and departments within the Alberta government again identify the Castle region as having considerable park potential. At the time, Parks Canada also urges the government of Alberta to consider the establishment of a large provincial park in the Castle River area to relieve some of the pressures on Waterton National Park. The town and MD of Pincher Creek purchased the resort in 1978. And then in 1979, the Castle River Basin, along with Waterton Lakes National Park, Glacier National Park, and some adjacent lands in Montana are declared a UNESCO International Biosphere Reserve. In the early 80s, there are a bunch of policy changes made internally by the government that expand industrial and resource development in the Castle and Greater Eastern Slopes, reducing environmental protections. This includes the 1984 amendments to the Eastern Slopes Policy. These are changes that were inconsistent with the evidence they had and recommendations internally, as well as past government recommendations and findings. In 1985, the government establishes the West Castle Development Authority, which was created with the stated goal to increase year-round recreation in the area and increase economy in southern Alberta. They take over managing the ski hill from the town and the MD of Pincher Creek. This year also, AWA again requests that South Castle be better protected, this time by inclusion in the protection zone under the Eastern Slopes policy, but we were again denied. In the late 80s and 90s, the West Castle Development Authority solicits proposals and accepts an offer from Vacation Alberta, a privately owned company based out of Edmonton, to develop West Castle Ski Hill into a 4-season resort. Vacation Alberta proposes to expand the ski hill to include 98 hectares of ski runs, 2 18-hole golf courses, 2 hotels, condominiums, townhouses, fourplexes, an RV park, and a commercial space. Assessments for the project are restricted to just the resort's footprint and do not consider the impacts of increased visitor and resident numbers in the region as a whole, nor impacts on the Castle River downstream. Oh, sorry, there's just some more. In 1993, the Natural Resources Conservation Board finds that the ski hill can only be expanded if the rest of the castle receives designation and protection as a wildland park. Based on this decision, the next year, the Alberta government convenes a consultation group to establish a wildland recreation area, but the group quickly dissolves because of disagreements between stakeholders on what activities should be allowed in the protected area. The government ultimately keels under the severe lobbying pressure and reverses its decision to establish the wildland recreation area. Because the protected area is never established, Vacations Alberta does not have permission to develop the ski hill into a 4-season resort. They end up suing the Alberta government in 1997, and the case is ultimately settled out of court. I just want to point out something really quick here. They had received conditional approval from the Natural Resources Conservation Board, and this was the authority who previously, before the All Seasons Resort Act came into place, would have dealt with development projects like these. And I'll talk a little bit more on that later, but so the town and the MD of Pincher Creek consider closing the ski hill, but a group of skiers from Southern Alberta get together, forming the company Castle Mountain Resort Inc., and purchase it instead. 40 additional hectares of public land are sold to the West Castle Development Authority around the now Castle Mountain Resort to allow for further development. In 1998, we get kind of our first protected area. 94 hectares of the nearby West Castle River wetlands are protected as an ecological reserve. It's a small win, but meaningful nonetheless. In 2000, the Crown of the Continent ecosystem, which the castle is a part of, is recognized as one of North America's 14 most biologically diverse and threatened regions. Despite such a recognition, the early 2000s also see expansions at the Castle Mountain Resort occurring without the requirement of an environmental impact assessment. A judicial review of the government's decision initiated by the Castle Crown Wilderness Coalition, of which AWA is a part of, finds that it was, quote, patently unreasonable for Alberta Environment not to require an environmental impact assessment. But a year later in 2005, that judicial review finding is overturned by the Alberta Court of Appeal, and development goes ahead without that impact assessment. In 2006, the proposal by Castle Mountain Resort to withdraw 30,000 cubic meters of water from the West Castle aquifer for snowmaking is withdrawn following statements of concern. Of particular concern were the potential effects on the water levels of the nearby wetlands and ecological reserve, and the implication for wildlife species such as the bull trout. Notably, this is also the year that the entire South Saskatchewan River Basin, in which Castle and we're situated, is closed from issuing any new water licenses, but we'll get more to that later. Over the next decade, the castle's ecosystems are increasingly recognized as important and necessary to preserve. It took decades of hard work by many impassioned folks, but it ultimately culminates in the official designation of the Castle Provincial and Wildland Parks in 2017, protecting over 100,000 hectares of alpine, subalpine, and montane ecosystems in the southern Rocky Mountain Natural Region, increasing ecological connectivity in the crown of the continent ecosystem and along the Yellowstone to Yukon, major wildlife corridor. So the reason I think it's important to consider this historical perspective is because in doing so, we see a couple of things. One, this area has been recognized as important to conserve for decades. Two, government decisions and directions change frequently, particularly under pressure and sometimes in spite of the best available evidence. And three, this concept of a four-season resort in the castle is not new, having been proposed multiple times before. So now I want to get to an ecological perspective, as you've heard me kind of drone on how important the ecosystems are here, but not really what makes them important. So with the north-south wildlife corridors, the Castle Wilderness is a vital ecological link, better connecting protected areas to the north, which include Banff and Jasper National Parks, to those further south, the Waterton Glacier International Peace Park. It's an area of high biodiversity and home to an incredible number of rare and threatened species, in part due to the funneling of southwesterly gale force Chinook winds down the Front Range canyons that generates the castle's unique ecosystem conditions. According to iNaturalist, which is a community science program where everyday members of the public can take pictures and have them verified, there is over 700 species documented in the castle, 140 of which are known to be threatened. But I guess sometimes people say, well, why does biodiversity even matter? What do I care how many different animals there are? And so what I would say is that landscapes that are diverse from the macro scale, ecosystem scale, to the species scale, to the genetic scale, or to the micro scale, these landscapes that are diverse are more resilient to change and challenges. And you can see that illustrated really well here by the Alberta Biodiversity Monitoring Institute. So I was trying to think of like a helpful metaphor about how biodiversity helps ecosystems. And so I think it's helpful to think about ecosystem like it's a hockey team. There are X amount of roles on the ice, but if your bench consisted of just enough players to fill them, you would quickly be outmatched. So instead, you have multiple players who play the same position. Similarly, an ecosystem has numerous species who all function in the same role. A strong ecosystem doesn't just consist of one monoculture of plant acting as that primary producer role. It has numerous species of plants doing so. And then by doing so, you can have specialization within that given role that gives you the ability to adapt to different situations. So if I'm building a hockey team, I've got my defensemen who above all are going to protect the goalie and the net, but one of them may be great on the power play and another on the penalty kill. My point is you've got a better chance at succeeding as a group if you cover all the bases multiple times over. Ecosystems are more robust if their unique niches are filled, more resilient if there's overlap for contingencies. And in turn, ecosystems better provide the services and benefits we all rely on, like water and air filtration, nutrient cycling, soil and production and retention, carbon storage, disaster mitigation, temperature regulation, and more. That is why areas that are naturally high in biodiversity, like the castle, are important to conserve and worth protecting. The castle overlaps with key wildlife and biodiversity zones. It's part of the core grizzly bear recovery zone. It is part of the important mountain goat and sheep areas, and ranges of species like species at risk like the limber and whitebark pine are also found here. These species are all sensitive to change, and so their presence, abundance, and absence are really helpful indicators for the region's overall health. The castle contains numerous alpine lakes and tarns, as well as alpine and subalpine wetlands. Over 26 major headwater streams of the Oldman River originate in the castle parks, 23 of which support populations of native cold water trout. It contains critical habitat for these species, which is habitat that has been identified as necessary for the species recovery and survival. And so in these maps here, you can see the drainage of the watershed is outlined in white, and then the critical habitat streams are shown in the kind of aquamarine and dark blue, and then the footprint of the Castle Mountain Resort is shown in that kind of pink grading. So in general, the largest threat to species is the loss of habitat, whether in terms of amount or quality. In the map here, all human footprint documented is highlighted on the landscape. While not all human footprint is equal in scale or type of impact, you can see that our presence as a species has touched almost all of the castle watershed already. Responsible stewardship and sustainable development demands this is acknowledged and factored into how the landscape is used and managed moving forward, so future generations can enjoy all the abundance and benefits it provides. I've got more biodiversity parameters and considerations I want to highlight, but not without more context about the All Seasons Resort Act. So first announced on November 7th, 2024, by December 5th of the same year, the Act had passed with no amendments and received royal assent. A year later, the accompanying policy and regulations were published. Acts, in sort of like layman terms or understanding, acts legally enable the government's actions. Policy outlines the overarching vision in general terms, while regulations detail the specifics and all the binding elements. And I make that distinction because often, if you're trying to hold the government accountable, it's best to point to the regulations, because many of our acts, like the Water Act, for instance, will say things like, no one can hurt or harm or degrade our watersheds. And we know that that happens all the time. And all of that's true in the Act until you look at the regulations, and the regulations show when that sort of activity is permitted. So by going to the regulations, often you can find what are the binding elements that you can actually hold developments and government accountable to. So you can see here from our minister's quote, pulled from one of the news releases on the All Season Resorts Act, which I will also call ASRA, that their intent is also to ensure that folks can enjoy these areas. The government is hoping to, quote, strike the right balance of economic growth, environmental stewardship, and Indigenous opportunity by incentivizing the responsible development of year-round destinations in our province. Critically, even well-intended things can have negative impacts, and some ways about how this act has come to be ring alarm bells. So after the act had already been passed, that was when the government chose to do public engagement. Over a week in May in 2025, the government solicited feedback on ASRA through a province-wide telephone survey that called 803 people. The survey found that growing tourism to diversify the provincial economy was important, with 3/4 of folks supporting the development of a limited number of all-season resorts in Alberta. They define a limited number as 10, which gives us some idea of maybe the number, I guess, that they're looking to develop. That support, though, however, was conditional on the basis that environmental impacts could be avoided, minimized, or mitigated, and that public land would not be sold. Much like what was found in the Plan for Parks engagement, the public wants more low-impact, affordable recreation opportunities like hiking and camping, but do not want to see the expansion of motorized recreation. I point this out because I think that the public's desire for recreation opportunities in like these landscapes maybe does not match what the government is looking for in the way that the act has been created. So what does ASRA do? It creates a new regulatory authority under the Ministry of Tourism and Sport that can now issue approvals, authorizations, and leases under existing legislation, including our Environmental Protection and Enhancement Act, our Water Act, and our Public Lands Act. It gives the minister the power to designate public lands and protected areas as a new designation, the all-season resort designation and use. Proponents can then submit proposals for an all-season resort on these designated lands, and the Act also sets timelines to speed up the review process and cut, quote, red tape. And so this is kind of one of the first red flags. Whenever the government says red tape, it raises alarm bells for me because often red tape is put there with a specific purpose to make sure that there are checks and balances and that development does not rush ahead without consideration for any other parts of our society. So I hate to see that word, and I think it should raise alarm bells. So the process works where the government chooses which public lands they will designate as an all-season resort. This process is largely internal. It does have an element where it says they're supposed to engage with the public and consult with Indigenous nations, but as we can already see, and what I'll point out earlier, there's 3 areas that have already been designated as all-season resorts, and they did not go through this process. So we've already kind of, the process has already been found, a go around. Then there's the expression of interest, where the government puts out a call to resort developers, selects one to move forward. Then there is this part 3, which is split into 2. The developer submits part of an application and conducts their own public engagement and Indigenous consultation. So that's another thing to highlight here. Engagement is developer-led. It is not being done by the government. Then they also submit what is called the Master Development Plan, which is really unique to All Seasons Resort. It's not really something we see with any other sort of developments in the province. And the Master Development Plan essentially outlines just like everything they intend to do. One, I think, positive that I saw as a part of the Master Development Plan is that they are required to identify the resort's capacity and like limits for visitor use, which is promising. How that will be evaluated and measured is something that's more unknown. So a developer would have to come forward and say, this is how many people will use our resort. This is the impact we think it's going to have. This is like our top number, but I don't know what part of this process actually checks that that is valid. Then this is where the timelines come in. The government has 150 days to review the master development plan and decide to issue approvals. Then the government decides whether to issue a all-season resort deposition, and then the developer submits their remaining applications under the Environmental Protection and Enhancement Act, the Public Lands Act, and the Water Act for review and approval. And then finally, the developer gets the green light to proceed with construction and operations. And so one thing I will point out in this process is that I think some of these steps are a bit backwards in that we're getting a lot of really critical information in steps like 3B and 4 that might inform whether or not we should even allow a resort developer to move forward in the process. And another key thing is that there is very limited, step 1 and step 3A are the only opportunities for public engagement, and they are very limited. The developer only has to have public engagement open for 30 days, which is a really short time frame to come up with a your comments if you want them to be really robust. And then the government also, it's unclear how that public consultation is going to work to find those public lands to designate. So yeah, anyways, I think a better process would be having some of these things happen sooner to then decide whether or not this resort should go forward. So some of the issues with the Act is it increases ministerial power. The ultimate decision for which lands become all-season resorts is the government. Anytime an Act increases the power of the minister or increases their discretion over elements I think one of the unfortunate things about our ministers is that they are not required to have expertise in the ministry which they lead. I think we would all like it if our Minister of Education was a teacher, or our Minister of Health was a nurse, or our Minister of Environment was a biologist or a wastewater management specialist, or just had some of that background. But because they are not required to have that expertise, it is really scary if they have the ultimate say over what happens to our public lands and collectively owned resources. They do have, a really robust group of civil servants underneath of them, but there's nothing that says that they have to listen to the advice or recommendations of their civil servants. And so I think it's really scary whenever we increase power and decision-making to the ministers when they are subject to lobbying influence and opinion. I think we'd all want our public lands to be managed in a way that is driven by research and evidence, and also robust public ability to participate. So yeah, anytime you see an act that gives more power or discretion to the minister should raise the red flags. Another issue is that 2 of the 3 of the area designations that came out immediately are in areas that are already receiving increased and unsustainable tourism pressure. I think it is a really like admirable thing to say, you know, we want to increase tourism, we want to get people out on the landscape, we want to show them how beautiful and diverse Alberta is. But I think that what this first action has done has showed they're not listening and they don't recognize that these landscapes do have a carrying capacity. To immediately put 2 designations in the Kananaskis, which receives millions of people every year, and now we're going to potentially increase tourism and use and human footprint on the landscape in seasons that otherwise might have some protection, and might have, like, humans might not be there. It's just like it feels like it's in bad faith. And the other thing is, another issue is that because we've now created a new regulatory authority under the Ministry of Tourism and Sport, this is the 3rd regulatory authority that now has the ability to kind of issue stuff under those acts I mentioned, including the AER as well. And so we saw when the AER was created in 2013, it meant a loss of expertise and talent, or like a movement of expertise and talent from environment over to AER. And so it feels like we are duplicating processes that in a way are kind of redundant. Like I guess I don't understand why we need a new regulatory authority when we already have very capable people at EPA that, you know, we're spreading ourselves thin. So those are some issues there. And then issues continued. There's limited opportunities for public input. Consultation and engagement is proponent-led. One of the things I flagged when this act first came out was that it's very top-down. So it's the government coming in and saying, this is where we're going to put an all-season resort. And anyone who lives in a community where tourism is the predominant industry knows that you can very easily grow up in a town and then get priced out of it because of tourism, unfortunately. And so I think as we invite increased tourism in, it's something that should be led by the municipalities or the Indigenous nations nearby. It should be something that the community asks for. It shouldn't be something that's top down, the government saying, we're going to do this here. And so the fact that there's also limited opportunities for the public input, it means there's limited opportunities for the communities where these projects are nearby to go in and express their concerns. Also another issue is that we're setting time limits, which is unfortunate because it can really reduce the thoroughness of reviews. Sometimes like reviews take a long time because you're trying to make sure you have like a comprehensive understanding of the project at hand. And by saying it has to be done in 150 days, like we already know many of these ministries are overburdened and overstressed, and they don't have enough resources and people to do the jobs they already have assigned. And so it's worrisome to like add this on top of that and say, you also have to do this in addition to all your work. And then the other big issue is a loss of protected areas. So we've already seen as these 3 all-season resort designations have come in that some lands have then been shifted from what was once a protected area or a public recreation area into an all-season resort area. And because this is so new, we don't know if an all-season resort area is necessarily going to provide the same level of protections that they had under their previous protected areas designation. So for like the Nakiska ski area, for Fortress Mountain Resort, this resulted in 131 hectares of provincial parkland being removed and added to the resort space. Castle actually did, Castle Mountain received, the Castle Parks received lands from the resort, which is great. It's nice to see expanded protected areas. But a bigger kind of issue with all of this is that all of this was done internally with the government, and something that the new process that they've set up has said is that any changes of land use require public consultation. So it's changes to the boundaries of protected areas and parks without public consultation. And it's just like it's like they knew what they wanted to do and then put the rules in afterwards. Then I guess this is the other kind of concerning part, is that because it's proponent-led engagement, I don't know if this is the extent of the public engagement that Nikiska is planning to do, but it is 4 questions. You have like a little block where you can put your concerns. But yeah, it's just not, it's not robust, and it's only open for 2 weeks. And so hopefully this is not the extent of it, but I think it's one of those things that shows that if you have a consistent process with the government that's clearly outlined the expectations for what public engagement should be, I think we would have a lot better results than leaving it up to the proponent every single time to decide. And it means that the public's going to go in and consult, and they might have a different process every time. So now I want to talk about, why are we even concerned about like the impacts of all season resorts? Like, why is it concerning that they might be 4 seasons? Like, what's the worry here? And so when we look at a ski hill, this is Castle. These are the existing impacts. So you can see wherever runs happen it's a loss of subalpine and some sort of montane habitat. It's deforestation to make the runs, defoliation. You are exposing the slopes now because you just make the runs for people to go down. And by exposing it, you are increasing these slopes to erosion and sedimentation. And mountain soils are they're like notoriously slow to form. It takes a really long time for it to do so. And so it's really scary if there's increases in erosion and sedimentation, because then we can lose them, and it's decades of work to make that soil just gone into the watershed, causing negative impacts for our aquatic ecosystems. It also impacts how precipitation, like snow and rain, is retained on the landscape and how it ultimately drains. So typically in a forest, when the snow falls, the trees collect it, and they can help slow it, so it'll actually store underground and slow it when it melts down the hills. But when it's kind of clear cut and it's left bare, when it melts, if it melts too fast, it can run down, and you can have kind of issues of flooding downstream, which is implication for the downstream watersheds. We're losing ecosystem benefits and services in the areas that are altered. And then we also get changes to wildlife behavior because their habitat has changed. So we're now creating big empty sight lines that may alter how prey moves and how predators chase them. So those are just some like very quick overarching existing impacts. And that is just what is already here. We also need to consider that like the watershed that we're in. So the Castle Mountain Resort is in the Castle River watershed, which drains into the Oldman, which drains into the South Saskatchewan River. 41% of the flows in the Oldman Reservoir come from the Castle River, so this is a really important watershed to contribute downstream. And we also have to consider that southern Alberta, we have unfortunately over-allocated our water, which means that we have licensed out more water for use than is sustainable in the watershed. The government, just as like a rule of thumb, usually recommends that in a given watershed, 85% of the flow should stay to retain the function and health of a river. But in comparison, like by the time the South Saskatchewan is leaving Alberta, we've allocated 72% of it. So we're way over what is sustainable. And while allocation is not necessarily equal to how much is actually used and consumed, you do get years like 23 and 24 where it was so dry that our consumption was well above like what was able, like we were consuming more and not leaving enough in the rivers for them to sustain themselves. So the good news about the castle is because it's the headwaters, it's got, you can see like the local surface water availability and how much has been allocated. Less than 1% in the castle has been allocated. So the rivers in the castle, they receive their full natural flows. that's not an issue there. But the issue comes to when we get to the Oldman River just below the dam, as the Castle and the Crowsnest and the Upper Oldman join. We're at 34%, and then as I said before, by the time it leaves the province, we're at 72% allocation. So whenever we're making sort of a land use decision, we have to consider the watershed, but you also have to consider the downstream conditions. Then another thing that I think needs to be considered is the Alberta Biodiversity Monitoring Institute and the provincial government together have developed these 4 biological indicators that are meant to inform land use planning in the province, one of which is native plant cover. So this is the area that is like visibly free from human disturbance and where we actually have native plants. And so I'm showing a map that's kind of zoomed out here, because another thing when we're doing when we're thinking about how we can best manage our land, we do it from a regional perspective rather than from like a very small, just the footprint perspective. It's one of kind of the good things about Alberta's system, except we just don't really utilize it. But this way, it's recognizing that development is not restricted to just the area or even the watershed that it's in, but it has broader effects and impacts like outside. And so I'm showing this because you can see here that our sort of Rocky Mountains region is where we have a lot of our like native plant covers still, and this gets sparser and sparser as you move east and downstream. And so you can see the Castle River watershed there, still like a very healthy amount of native plant cover. Let me just see here. So native plant cover is important, as having high quality native habitat available is associated with greater species richness and resilience, as well as increased biodiversity. Retention of native cover is also important, as reclaimed sites post-human disturbance rarely reflect the full ecosystem function and biochemical processes of the pre-disturbed area. And so as the largest contributor to biodiversity loss on Earth has been declining native habitat, it is critical to retain what remains. Another one of those biological indicators is interior habitat. So the interior habitat indicator is developed to quantify what we call the edge effects of human disturbance. And it reflects the amount of habitat that lies outside the range of influence. So here provides us a little bit more information, even though we have, mostly the Castle River had, a lot of it was covered with native plant cover. The areas that provide like a 50-meter buffer, and then the areas that provide a 500-meter buffer from human influence are less and less. So not just human actual footprint, so not just like the things we build on the landscape, they also have effects that kind of go outside of them. And so this shows that even though you have that native plant cover, the areas that species might want to use, especially if they're really sensitive to human disturbance, is considerably less. So some examples of edge effects include changes in the microclimate conditions from increased exposure to sun, wind, and precipitation, changes in temperature and moisture, increased traffic and or human presence, and the introduction of contaminants and invasive species and noise. Another one we've got here is landscape connectivity. So connected landscapes are more adaptive and resilient compared to those that are fragmented. It's crucial for maintaining regional populations, gene flow, and rural landscape biodiversity and ecosystem health over time. As overall habitat availability reduces, habitat fragmentation also constrains ecosystem function and biodiversity. So once again, even though we have all that native habitat cover, if it's divided, it limits how species can use it. And so these indicators, this indicator is measured on a scale of 0 to 100, with 100 being closest, like that would be equivalent to reference conditions without any human impact. And so looking at this, even like you can see that the Castle River is, compared to its other watersheds, has the best landscape connectivity, but it's still not like really even close to what it would be without human disturbance. So it's kind of around that 40 to 50% range. And then as you go downstream, habitat is more and more fragmented, which makes it harder for species to use. So when landscapes become more fragmented, movement, reproductive success, and the ability for species to attain the necessities of survival are all restricted. We also see losses in genetic diversity. Seed dispersal, seedling recruitment, and pollinator movement can be negatively impacted by landscape fragmentation and loss of connectivity between suitable habitat types, and thereby reducing the reproductive success of native plant species and contributing to reduced biodiversity and biomass. And yeah, so also the disturbances associated with habitat fragmentation, such as creating roads or clearing sections of tree cover, can alter predator-prey dynamics, as I mentioned before. This indicator measures both structural and functional connectivity, which captures the ability of both species and ecological processes to move and function freely in a given area. And then our last one is stream connectivity. And this reflects how connected aquatic ecosystems are on both a spatial and temporal scale. And it's important to support healthy populations and life histories of aquatic organisms at all trophic levels. So typically the main threat to stream connectivity is barriers, as they fragment stream networks and restrict movement of species. In Alberta, the predominant barrier is culverts. Here's the first time we see kind of a reverse of what we've seen before. Typically, the Castle River watershed is doing a lot better than its neighboring watersheds. But in this case, it is not, and that is because stream connectivity is measured at a higher watershed level. It's not measured kind of like at the Castle River level, it's measured at like the whole Old Man above the dam. And the dam is a major barrier to stream movement, which is why it has this kind of whole watershed has such worse stream connectivity, because the dam has kind of like an it's influencing the value more so than other things. So I don't know what stream connectivity is like specifically in the castle, so that's just to kind of take that with a grain of salt. Yeah, so those are our 4 biological indicators. And I like to point these out because this is something that was developed by the government to inform land use. And so whenever I submit my comments, I point to these and say, this is what the values are in this given area. And so it should be informing how you develop here. And so kind of what we've seen is that we have native plant cover in the castle, and it is somewhat well connected, but it could be better. And that there's still pretty substantial edge effects from the existing human footprint we have in the area. And then finally, this is the biodiversity intactness index. So when biodiversity is lost within an ecosystem or diversity of a landscape itself is lost, the overall ecological community becomes unstable, creating issues in the food chain and instability in the way resources are regulated and cycled. Biodiversity directly drives how well an ecosystem functions and how effective it is at providing ecosystem services. These services account for all the value, economic and otherwise, that directly results from healthy ecosystems. So this index ranges from 0 to 100% again, or 101%, I guess. Where at like 101% intact, the abundance of both species is equal to the abundance expected in an undisturbed area. I think 101 is like there's even greater abundance than expected, compared to one with 0% human footprint. So this is where we can see that the castle has areas where biodiversity is abundant, where it is thriving, where it is at levels that we would expect if there was no human footprint. It just shows that this is a really, biodiverse area worth protecting, but there are some areas within the castle where we've had human footprint or human activities in the past that have reduced how much biodiversity is there. So changes in biodiversity is also important to factor in an area. So since 2010, total connectivity, both landscape and stream, and interior habitat values have remained actually relatively the same, decreasing by less than 1%. All are above the provincial averages except for stream connectivity, and total native plant cover in terrestrial, aquatic, and wetland ecosystems has actually increased by 2%. We do see the largest changes that were observed were for the connectivity of ecosystems in the lowlands, which have declined by 4%. Yeah, so I point out all those things because as we manage the castle moving forward, I think they should be informing the context of what we want to achieve. The area is now protected technically in the Castle Provincial Parks. The key part about protection is that it's not enough just to designate that an area has been protected, you also have to manage it well. And one of the issues with how the castles are currently being managed is that even though they have management plans that were really developed through extensive public consultation, they have not been implemented fully. So one of the key things that was identified when those plans came into, when they were first published in 2018, was that we needed to phase out motorized vehicle use in the castle parks because they were contributing to soil erosion that the landscape just couldn't handle. And that's something that still hasn't been achieved, even though it was written into the management plan. And so that is also something that needs to inform how we manage this thing moving forward. We've got protected areas, but they're not being implemented as was promised and identified by the evidence and data and engagement collected. And so then when we go back to the all-season resort, we need to kind of think about that surrounding area and then also what is actually possible here. And so when you look to Nikiska and Fortress, when you look at the plans that they've put forward, they include things like, like, what was it, a mountain roller coaster and, like who described it? Fortress was described as being like an amusement park. Like it is much higher in activity than what is currently there. And I think moving forward, we're just gonna have to see kind of what is proposed here. And what is proposed, how does it work with the rest of the landscape? Is it appropriate for the rest of the landscape? Like when back in 1993, when they proposed an all-season resort, one of the things was that they wanted to have 2 golf courses in the lowland sort of river valley here, which would be bordering the river and is where the wetlands are. And something like that would be inappropriate in that it would have impacts for a watershed and impacts to a watershed that's really important for providing flows downstream. And so really, I guess what's difficult about this is that we don't know what will be proposed. We don't know if Castle will propose anything. Right now, currently on their website, it says they're dedicated to providing, like an excellent winter recreation opportunity. They might not be interested in doing an all-season resort at all, but we won't know until they propose it because of how the process has been set up. And so when they propose it, I think what we want to what has changed now is that it is completely surrounded by protected areas that we want to improve how they're being managed. And we'd have to take into consideration the edge effects that anything developed here will then have on the management of those provincial parks and whether or not it's actually compatible with the landscape. And that would start with like a really robust environmental impact assessment. But because it's so late in the process, like we can't know until they have I guess like announced it. So there's a lot of unknowns with this, but I hope I provided sort of a context of the surrounding area and the expectation and the threats that exist there to help inform what may be coming forward and help inform the comments people would want to provide should we see a resort proposal come from Castle Mountain. And then I just have my resources highlighted here, which are also really good resources should you ever want to look around. I speak very highly of this mapping tool from the Alberta Biodiversity Monitoring Institute. It's where I got all of the biological indicators. And then, our government's Fish and Wildlife Internet mapping tool is also useful to see sensitive ranges of animals. Lots of good places. The Environmental Law Center also has a really in-depth explanation from a lawyer perspective of all of the things with the All Seasons Resort Act. I think the act has promising language, but like all legislation, it comes down to how it's implemented. And often, unfortunately, things are not implemented as they are written, and there's many loopholes to get around. So it's really up to the public to hold the government accountable to what our expectations are for our own public lands. So thank you.
That was jam-packed with information, wasn't it? That was very informative, Kennedy, and I'm sure there are lots of questions. So I'm going to shift the microphone back and forth, and I'll try and keep track of who's asking questions in order so that people who want to learn more can do so. Questions, anybody? No, none? Yes, one at the back, the lady, yes.
Impact does public consultation actually have? I know this ASRA is new, but just in your experience.
I think it really depends on who's listening. So I think public impact in the past we have seen, or public engagement in the past has been really influential. Like the Eastern Slopes policy developed in the 70s really changed how we managed Eastern Slopes in a really meaningful way. I know that part of that public engagement involved actually flying Peter Lougheed up above the Rocky Mountains and showing him the areas that would be impacted by things like open pit coal mines and strip mining. But that's the place where we saw people's feedback, be integrated in a meaningful way. Similarly, I've heard that the engagement around how the castle parks were to be managed was also really good. But it depends on who's listening. And so unfortunately, what I'm seeing right now in my own sort of work is that people are providing feedback and the legislation that is coming out does not match at all what is provided. So a really good example I can point to is recently amendments were made to Alberta's Water Act. The government did 2 rounds of public engagement and did not release the survey results, but I did submit a Freedom of Information request to find those results. And one of the things that was in those results was that people's top priority was environmental protection. They wanted amendments to come in place that would better protect our watersheds. The amendments that ultimately came out didn't do that at all. They didn't even mention environmental protection. That wasn't a priority at all. So I think what's really difficult right now is that one of the tools that previously we could point to for people and say, have your voice be heard, get it in, is not working as effectively as it should. And I wish I had a better answer for that. But I do think that overwhelming public pressure makes a difference. And so maybe it is a benefit right now that the main proponent is not the government. Maybe it's a benefit right now that the person you would be engaging with on these all-season resorts is the developer. Maybe they will be more amenable to public comment, especially if they know that this is the community they have to be accountable to. This is the community that will use this resort, right? So I think, yeah, that's kind of a roundabout answer, and that sometimes it's really effective and sometimes it is not at all. But I think we have to keep trying. But I also would say that one of the things with this type of work is that you have to pull on every lever. And so even if you think something's not working, you do it as like a contingency, and then you also try something else. And you have to just try every tool we've got in the toolkit and hope that one of them works out.
Yes, Denise.
So the government has designated it as a 4-season resort. It does not mean that it necessarily will become a 4-season resort. I think Castle Mountain Resort would have to come forward with their master development plan about how they would make it a 4-season resort, but that's up to them. And I'm a little bit unclear of if Castle Mountain Resort never comes forward with a plan to do 4 seasons, if they decide that they want to do skiing, they're committed to skiing, that is the extent of it. I don't know if that means that the government allows other proposals from other proponents to come in and say because technically the area is leased to them. So yeah, it's unclear, and it would really be like, it's kind of the balls in their corner here. Yeah.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Catherine. I work with Castle Resort. I just want to touch base on the consultation piece. I've been involved with the all-season resort legislation as well. When we talk about consultation, there's actually two pieces to consultation. So what we see with Nikiska up there right now, they have not submitted an all-season resort application, and so they're actually taking a step ahead and taking on consultation themselves. When they get to the all-season resort application, they then have to, the consultation goes through the government website. That's what we're seeing right now with the Silvertip gondola proposal and the fortress. It's actually going through the government, so they do see it as well. Because this example is just a little bit different because they're doing a slightly different process of how they're going about summer operations. So consultation, they are taking that into consideration. Definitely lots going on in this space, and interesting, and thank you so much for the presentation. It was excellent to learn about biodiversity. But yeah, lots of moving pieces with this regulation moving forward.
Thank you for that clarification. Yes.
What's the requirement for the proponents to publish that they are putting an application forward? There are some things we find buried on page 942 of the ASRA website at times, and would never know that there was an opportunity to comment on something because we didn't know it was there, without people like you absolutely scouring those websites. But do the proponents have to actually publish that they're going into public consultation phase? And if so, how far and how wide?
Did everybody hear the question?
I've never been called quiet, so someone say no.
So for like the pre-engagement that we're seeing kind of Nikiska doing here, I think it went out, like I saw it kind of in newspapers. For the kind of next piece of it, when you're kind of further in that process of that, like 3A on that map I showed, that to my understanding, it's like 30 days, and I think it would have to be very similar to how projects are, where they give the public notice in a local newspaper or like around the neighborhood, how they distribute it. And so I can't speak for how like they will move forward with the resorts, but sometimes it is just buried deep, and I'm hoping that it would be a lot. I'm hoping it would be different, and that it would be spread widely, because I think that it's one of those things that they don't like. I think everybody wants the best. And so knowing that you have pretty exhaustive public engagement, I think creates the best. And so making sure that's distributed widely, like make sure everybody knows about it, and it makes sure later down the road, it's probably even good for proponents, so that no one can come and say, well, we weren't consulted on this, or we didn't hear about this. So I think it's in the best interest for that to be very widely published to as many, local resources as they possibly can. Yeah.
Thank you. Anybody else have a question? Yes.
So I was in a presentation yesterday, that was on tourism in Pittsburgh, and there they pointed out that the population of Alberta was 2 million people 20 years ago. It's 5 million now, and it's going to be 10 million in another 20 years. The majority of it's going to be here. So what's your message for us?
The question is related to how quickly Alberta's population is growing, and she's still recording the sound, so that's why I'm repeating it. Did you want?
Yeah, sure.
And so how is that increased population by fourfold going to make a difference?
I think when we think about things as like if we're thinking about the whole province as an ecosystem, there is like a carrying capacity. And so in southern Alberta, when we see a threshold reached, like the fact that we cannot license out any more water, in fact, we should actually be trying to figure out how we can reduce those allocations and return flows into the rivers. That's a very real threshold to deal with. And so like I've heard the Premier say before that she has ambitions to reach 10 million in Alberta. And I think that the reality of the environment we live in is going to be the constraint there. And so, I think I also think too, like, part of it is concentration, right? Like, we have to get some of the concentration of our human use out of areas that are heavily used and spread it more evenly around to areas that can sustain it. And so, yeah, you don't want to see like so much tourism in the Bow Valley. You don't want to see so much tourism in Kananaskis. And so places like the castle might be a good place for tourism opportunities if done in a responsible and sustainable way.
Good question. Anyone else? Yes.
Just something more of a statement that my career was working within Kananaskis country and being privy to Fortress Mountain and the Kiska through my job as a district conservation officer. And I can tell you that, for example, Fortress, it's not a viable ski hill at all, unless at the time when they revisited this about 12 years ago, they could get more water relocation. They couldn't. The Kananaskis River was tapped out. So their response was, how about we use their sewage lagoons to make artificial snow? So that's the only way the hill could become viable. And then, of course, the person sitting and representing water said, no, there's no way we can look at that. The other thing, too, was Fortress Mountain, the only way it becomes viable is if there's a massive on-house or on-site housing. That's originally why it was shut down. They went ahead and built condos on there, and then they thought, well, better to do it now, and then we'll just ask for forgiveness. Well, it didn't work in that way. Those two areas, Kiska and Fortress, probably have some of the best data available anywhere in North America. I mean, we've had an extensive grizzly bear management program, reversion program for probably going on now 35 years. It's probably the biggest in North America. So grizzly bear telemetry there is extensive. And it was shown with Fortress and Kiska that a lot of bears, their prime habitat in the summers was up high slopes. The data's all there. The other thing that saved the Kiska from having expansions in the past, because they had asked us before, was our senior park ecologists had cameras at the very top. And the Kiska actually wanted to put a lift all the way to the top. So those cameras saved or prevented that from happening, because it was shown that there was wolves, grizzly bears, cougars, and even wolverines up there. So the data is there. So those two areas, given all the study and the data that's there, are going through this now, and the government is, finally going ahead with this act. Don't hold out a lot of hope, because I think the writing's on the wall.
That's a good summary of how Nakiska and Fortress were both restrained in development because of data that was already collected by the government. Any comment, Kennedy?
Yeah, no, maybe just one thing that to point out is kind of a worry about, like, speaking of good grizzly bears, is that so having the ski hills operate in the winter, the grizzly bears are typically inactive, and so you can kind of miss them, although we didn't really see that actually in Banff National Park this year, where there was, I think, a black bear or maybe two that had to get relocated off the ski hill. But one of the good things about the ski hills is that because they're not being used in the summer, it excludes human activity, and then those bears then have that habitat back in the summer to go and feed and get, big. And so one of the things that we do point out in the Nakiska and Fortress is that by having it become a four-season resort, that is now habitat that's unavailable for these species to use during that time. And as we kind of force species out of like the last remaining remnants of habitat that they have, we can force them into areas where they shouldn't be, like our towns, and we can get more human wildlife conflicts, which very usually end in the death of a bear or another wildlife species. And so that is another thing that I think has to be a really big part of this, is anyone coming forward with a proposal has to say, like, how do they make sure that we maintain human wildlife coexistence and we're not pushing these species out of like the last remaining areas they have on the landscape, and we're not like resulting in more dead wildlife. So yeah.
Excellent points. Anyone else? I'll take you and then the fellow with the beard at the back, yes. Go ahead.
Is there a level of development at non-winter based development at Castle Mountain Resort that you would see as acceptable, and what are those thresholds that you would identify as important not to pass on?
So is there non-winter development now at Castle, and what would the thresholds be if some were to happen?
So I think so essentially what I did here was what we would call like a desktop review of the environmental conditions. So this is just like all the available information, not all the available information, but like as much available information on the web that I could find to describe the existing kind of biological conditions. But what would need to be done, I think first would need to be so an environmental impact assessment. So this includes like field studies, site surveys to see where species actually are on the landscape, where we have, dens and nests and hibernacula and important areas for these species, where we'd have to make sure any sort of development like avoided. Another thing that I think is really useful is in that one metric, the biodiversity intactness index that I showed, that's actually a compilation of many different species relative abundance. And the ABMI has a really detailed data set where you can go in species by species and it will show, like, if you build a paved road, what is the impact on like the western toad? Does it increase its abundance? Does it like decrease its abundance? And so you can go through and see that impact. And it's really, really detailed. And so I think something that could be done is you could look at, a suggested land use, choose some indicator species or umbrella species that show sort of the general health. So like a grizzly is a really good one. If you have an abundance of grizzlies, everybody underneath is really healthy because they need so many calories. And so you could look and you could see, what impacts grizzlies, what type of land uses impact grizzlies, how can we avoid or minimize those impacts, what are the acceptable uses. And so I think, unfortunately, the answer is that you want to do more research and you want to do site-specific research where you get wildlife biologists on the ground to go and see what's there and then look back at that data and show what might be acceptable. And then you could also look at the biodiversity indicators and compare those values and see if we put this in, how will it impact habitat or native cover? Will it decrease the amount of native cover? You can look at it and say, is it going to further fragment the landscape? What can be done on existing human footprint, right? How can we reduce expanding human footprint and how can we use what we already have? I think those are that's what I would point to, and I think that's really a part of the process, and unfortunately you don't know until the environmental impact assessment is done, and that's why when I pointed to the progress and the thing is it's something that I think should be happening a lot earlier, and the legislation kind of avoids using environmental impact assessment. It says more you need to look at the environmental effects, but I think that that needs to be done early in the process, and it needs to be publicized early in the process so that people can scrutinize it, make sure the methodology was sound. Yeah, that would be my answer.
And do you know about existing summer usage at Castle Mountain Resort? Anybody?
I'm not sure. Maybe the folks
Anybody
at
else know?
Very, very limited. We do some hiking.
Yeah.
Hiking and then the Huckleberry Festival at the end of August, right?
I do
Yeah.
have one comment to that.
So when the government did do that telephone survey, one of the things they pointed to was the recreation that people wanted to use. People were interested in hiking, people were interested in camping. But one of the other ones that I thought was really charming and fun was people were interested in expanded historic tourism opportunities, which is out of a little different. And I think of it's something that could be compatible with the landscape. I think people are looking for adventures that they can get to better know their area. So that's another thing that maybe might not take a whole bunch of development, but getting a really well-resourced historian in to come and talk about the area, or connecting with the indigenous nations and talk about cultural use if that's something they're comfortable with. I think that some of those activities are much less low impact, but are ones that are clearly in demand. That was, yeah, anyways, I just remembered that.
It's a great idea. Yes.
Thanks for your talk. This is one of the really surprised the government interfered with the mandates. Wondering what has this happened before? Why is this more to the story? I know you were part of the committee, or
I missed the first part of that question, sorry.
just asking about the government interference in your venue.
Oh, I actually have no idea.
Oh, we don't know. The only thing I was told was that higher-ups decided that Ms. Halvorson should not speak at Frank Science Center. That's all.
She's pretty dangerous.
Well, she is committed for different reasons that, yes, and like some people don't like, yeah. And I don't think it has much to do with your behavior. It's just that you're clear in your commitments to biodiversity and the environment.
Weren't you on a committee? In the beginning, you explained you were on a committee about this issue with the.
Were you on the planning committee for the legislation?
No,
That, okay.
I submitted feedback, much like many other environmental organizations, and it really didn't, it wasn't anything much different than those environmental organizations said. Also, I know that there were specific ENGOs that were a part of the ASRA planning process, and they said very similar things to what I said, so I don't know if that is necessarily what it was about. I had mentioned earlier that the other time I had presented here was during the public hearing on the Grassy Mountain Mine, and maybe it is related to that occasion, but this is the first time I've not been allowed to speak somewhere, so it's all new for me.
You've adjusted remarkably well. Any other questions from the group? Yes.
I was part of a recreation advisory group. So Castle has a management plan, had a management plan in place. And then when Jason Nixon was the environment minister, he asked us to rethink it because we were having quite a bit of pushback for the motorized route. And one of the things that the Castle Mountain plan, not Castle Mountain, the Castle area came up was if they were to reduce, in fact, they were to get rid of all motorized traffic there. And it wasn't, there was a lot of people who were very upset. So they lobbied Jason Nixon. Jason Nixon came to the communities and we formed a RAG, Recreation Advisory Group. And it went on for more than 2 years. And out of that, apparently came a trail act that none of us, well, not the non-motorized anyway. In fact, it was interesting, on that group, twice as many motorized were part of that group as non-motorized. And we tried several times to point out that 85% of Albertans want non-motorized activities in this project. And they wouldn't listen. So the only reason I'm bringing that up is because I'm so skeptical. I'm so skeptical that anything good can come out of this government. And I'm sorry, that's just a little round there, but honestly, it's just so discouraging.
Testimony from a member of the Provincial Recreation Advisory Group.
Over more than 2 years the last time.
With 2 years of meetings, and 2/3 of the membership supported motorized recreation and only 1/3 non-motorized, and the results were in favor of the motorized.
Yeah, and so that was, I heard about that process from past staff, and I heard it was a very miserable, difficult process. And so that's something that also kind of informs this context of that we have these protected areas that are meant to be protected. We have a management plan that says there should be no motorized use here to protect threatened species like grizzly and like bull trout, which are really sensitive to the impacts of motorized recreation, largely as the stream crossings and the nearness and the linear density on the landscape. And so it's one of those things of like, if Castle Mountain Resort is to further develop, I think one of the conditions should be that the management plan of the Castle Provincial Parks is fully enforced. Similar to like when the all-season resort was proposed in 1993, one of the conditions that the Natural Resources Conservation Board at the time had put in was that it can only become an all-season resort if it's surrounded by protected areas. We've got those protected areas now, but they are not being, you know, protected to the fullest capacity. And so maybe it's a really good point to like raise of like, if we were gonna have development here, we need to do better here. Yeah.
Anyone else? Very important information for us who live in this area and in the Castle River Basin. So thank you very, very much, Kennedy. We've enjoyed your presentation and we hope you keep on stating your mind.